Okay, hello everyone. Hi, I'm Emily Richards. I'm founder and director of the Stickman consultancy, and I am absolutely delighted to be joined by Andrew Lewer, so MP for Northampton South. Hi, Andrew, how are you?
Hello, great to be here, Emily. Thank you.
Oh, thank you for joining us. It's a real pleasure. And in fact, we saw each other fairly recently, didn't we? When you very kindly invited me down to London to the ISC celebrating partnerships event, which was fantastic to hear all about the work that you're doing in terms of independent schools and state schools working together, collaborating, sharing expertise, facilities and best practice. So it's really, really great, the work that you're doing in that space.
No, and again, this is unscripted, but yes, what we were doing was launching this, which was the Celebrating Partnerships booklet. And as you say, we've been doing that for some significant number of years now, since I founded the All-Party Group for Independent Education, and either myself or my colleague in the Lords, Rafe Lucas, tend to host it either down at the House of Lords end or at the Commons end. And no, we had, as you say, we had a super attendance of people, and so much positivity and so much to celebrate, even in the difficult times for both the sector and more broadly as well.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Well, let's touch on that a little bit more in a second. First, I'd just like to ask you a little bit about you and kind of your career pathway. What brought you to this point, and what drives you?
Well, in terms of this subject, from starting from the sort of professional side and then back to the personal, maybe afterwards. After a career in publishing, I got into local government, and I found myself quite quickly, after first getting into local government, becoming leader of Derbyshire County Council. So a big step up for me, 30,000 employees, £1.3 billion turnover, and then a more direct role within schools than local authorities have now. We're still very much involved, but really more on the sort of child protection and children's services side now, whereas then there was a lot more in-house support for schools and schools advisors within the local authority and what have you. And I sort of made a bit of a point of getting around to see all the chief officers of the council that I'd just become the leader of, because when I became the leader, my party, the Conservatives, hadn't won in Derbyshire since 1977. So it was a big culture change. And one of the ways that was really illustrated was when I went to see the director of education, and he said to me, "Well, congratulations on becoming the leader of the council. And as you'll know, we've got 48 secondary schools." And I remember sort of saying, "Well, no, hold on, I think we've got 55 secondary schools, haven't we?" And you could sort of almost see this penny dropping from a huge height as they realised, hold on, what does he mean? Oh, yes, of course, because independent schools have been a bit sort of the collective noun version of persona non grata for many years, and they weren't with me. And so we tried to do a bit of early independent state school partnership working and got that sort of off the ground. But then the political pendulum swung in the other direction, and I ended up going from being a county council leader to being a member of the European Parliament. So my sort of little USP in politics is I'm the only person in Britain currently who's been a council leader, an MEP, and an MP. So when I was on the in the European Parliament, I was on the Culture and Education Committee there in Brussels and Strasbourg, largely through having had that local government background, but also I'd been a university governor for some years by then. And when I was there, I had a very good friend who's a Portuguese MEP who was moving into a different committee soon after I'd started, but we got on very well very quickly. So he sort of handed to me the annual chairmanship of the ENCNACE conference, the European National Associations of Independent Schools conference. Thought, well, fine, I'll give that a go. Very interesting hearing about all those different countries' education systems and the positive or not so positive state of their independent sector, and particularly how it interacted with the state sector, which is much more intensely, in some cases, Holland and Denmark in particular. And so after 3 years of that, I was expecting to be in the European Parliament for rather longer than I ended up being, and made the move directly, literally from 1 week to the next, from being an MEP to being an MP here in Westminster. And we're sat in my Westminster office, as you can perhaps see. And I thought, well, I didn't really want all that experience to go to waste. So I got together with the Independent Schools Council, and we talked about maybe having something a bit informal just to sort of celebrate independent schools and partnership working. And then we thought maybe Friends of Independent Education. And then we ended up going that step further and forming the all-party parliamentary group for independent education, which has been going for about 5.5 years. But I mean, winding back from that, my mother was a teacher, and I went to a school that I was very proud of and still have some very fond memories of, still very connected to it, in fact. And that was Queen Elizabeth's Grammar School, 1585. It was founded in Ashbourne in Derbyshire. Yes. And although it was a state school, when I went to university, no one would sort of believe me that it was, because it was a state school with boarders, with a cadet force, with prefects, you name it, very good results, etc. And, gave me a sort of quite in-depth appreciation of the value of a good and, in my view, a traditional form of education as well. So, I mean, that was the personal route. But then, as I say, it's gone through those professional iterations through to now being both on the Education Select Committee here in the Commons, but also for some significant years now chairing that all-party group.
Fantastic. What a journey. And I guess that leads me on to my next question is, so that experience you had, what is your why behind you doing, having that journey and driving that and setting up the all-party group?
Well, I mean, it's a combination of thinking that choice and flexibility in education is important, and parents being able to make their own decisions. But actually, the fact that people can make their own decisions and have that freedom and flexibility is of benefit to the whole education sector, because by having good quality independent education around and good schools, it's a motivation to some state schools to keep on top of their game as well. Certainly felt like that to me in my educational background. And so it's about the choice. It's also about the fact that it's the sector that is able to innovate. And I'm pinching here from Christopher Wheeler, the head at Monkton Combe, who said this to me. And I feel the need to credit him, because it's such an important insight that whilst bursaries and other elements of what the independent sector provides more broadly are certainly a benefit and important, it is actually that ability to provide an alternative education model, to experiment, to innovate, at the same time, strangely, as sort of protecting and respecting history and tradition as well, that adds to the mix in British education and enables us to learn from innovation and have this, I know it's an overused expression for all sorts of sectors that perhaps don't always merit it, but I think in this case it's true, a really world-leading sector that the rest of the world very often look to and admire, and yet I sometimes feel we don't appreciate or celebrate enough ourselves. So I wanted an all-party group to make sure that those messages could get through not only to Parliament but to government. And there's been several examples of where the all-party groups had a big impact in that sense. Certainly through COVID, we did a lot of work. I was able to chair on Zoom a meeting fortnightly with the then Minister Baroness Berridge, who's responsible for the independent sector, and people like ISBA, the bursars, Independent Schools Council, the Boarding School Association, etc. Because one of the reasons we're having this current debate about VAT and charitable status and so on is that the way the independent sector works and some of the needs of some of the elements of independent sector, the way that schools are often 7 to 13 rather than to 11, the needs of boarders, the needs of international pupils, etc., weren't sufficiently appreciated. And when there's a time of crisis like there was in COVID, it was important that there were to be a sort of conduit in, so that government would think, when they're making a rule about residential education, then they assumed that was universities, and we had to sort of remind them sometimes that there was other residential accommodation as well. Work on things like the teachers' pension scheme, but also just having people in to share best practice, both within the UK and also some of the international sessions and seminars that we've had as well.
Fantastic. And just going back to that, as you say, we're quite uniquely placed with that kind of traditional setting. And we love it at Stickman when we see schools kind of blending tradition with that innovative outlook, and it offers children something very special, in our opinion, and it's always a joy to see that when we're working with schools. Lovely that you support that too. So what would you say are the biggest challenges right now facing independent schools?
Well, I mean, obviously the big one now, and it was very much the topic when I was one of the guest speakers at the independent schools show over at the QE2 here in London last week, is this pledge by Labour that if they come into government in, I think the general election is probably going to be October 24. We don't know, but that would be my best guess. That they'll bring in VAT on school fees and abolish charitable status. And I know it's been said by many people. There's been some very good newspaper articles about it and what have you. But the fact is that will damage the sector at the most affordable end, and therefore the end that isn't elite, that isn't the sort of stereotypical photograph that a lot of newspapers use when they're doing a story about independent education. They just pull out the stock photograph of Eton and Harrow. But it is more like, schools like the Boys and Girls Division in Bolton and some of the schools in Altrincham, some of the schools, that are away from the obvious, not necessarily well understood offering that independent education provides at a generally more affordable and more down-to-earth level. It will be those schools that will suffer because they are the people, and again, it's a stereotype, but it's still worth repeating, who forgo the exotic foreign holiday, who keep the car for 10 years or what have you, to be able to have their children going through there. I mean, I will say, one of the roles of the all-party group, and I feel myself as the chairman of it, is to be, a critical friend of the sector. And some of the fee inflation that we've seen in the last 10 or 15 years hasn't helped with this case. So when you've had fees going up, tracking sort of grandparents' property prices rather than parents' income, it's making it more difficult to make the case now that this VAT increase, this 20% on top of currently 10% inflation or what have you, will be quite so calamitous. Now, there's an argument that it'll cause an immediate closures of large numbers of schools. My even deeper worry, I would say, is that those who've already got children in there will dig even deeper and even go for equity release or what have you, just to get their children through it. The problem will come in slightly slower motion, I think, or at least even more of a problem will come in slower motion, where people who had been thinking about coming in at 11 or at 13 or even at 16 will think, now it's just out of reach now and I can't do it. And that will make it more difficult for politicians like me to advocate for the sector, because it will become the increasingly elite pursuit that those who are opposed to it try and portray it as being already.
Yes. Yeah, it's so interesting, isn't it? It is those families just on the tipping point, isn't it? You know, they are giving up those holidays, like you say, hanging on to the same car, and just kind of, it's a real squeeze for them, isn't it? They're really going to feel the pinch. It's going to be tough, and interesting to see how this rolls out. But as you say, it's going to deter those people from entering the market as well, isn't it? So
yes, it is, and have the impact on the state schools by having those extra numbers coming in.
Yes,
I mean,
class sizes swelling.
Yes, I mean, Barnaby Lennon has said before, the chairman of the Independent Schools Council, that many parents who are paying for their children to go through school are actually paying for 3 children per child. In some cases, they're paying for their own child's education. They're paying for another child's education through the tax they pay that they're not utilising by taking up that state school place, and often they're contributing towards bursary places for another child as well. So, you know, the impact of this will be multiplied, and it's almost what I think my political opponents would see as a positive byproduct of this, that not only will it they think have this financial benefit, which I think there's very overwhelming evidence. And while we're doing props, I'll get another one out here, which is the Baines-Cutler report that the Independent Schools Council commissioned a couple of years ago, that demonstrates that the VAT impact is actually negative to the Treasury rather than positive. But there's this political outcome as well, the higher rarefication of the independent sector, so that not as many people are involved in it, and therefore it doesn't matter as much to as many people, and therefore becomes more and more removed from people's day-to-day lives and their own educational experiences.
Yeah. Wow, gosh, big impact. What in your view can schools do? I mean, we have strong views on in this from sort of a marketing point of view, and how schools can help themselves. But what can schools do, faced with this?
Well, I think, first of all, any school's governing body and bursars have to have this at absolutely the top of their risk register. I mean, I've been going on about it for a while, but a lot of people, not everyone, but a lot of people have said, yeah, well, they always say this, but I don't think they'll really do it, and it'll be too complicated, and they'll end up getting caught in the weeds of what is a charity, and every charitable status is different, and what about VAT on accommodation versus food versus tuition, and what about people who have, the Labour Party's version of private education, which is having their children at a state school, but then paying a fortune for tutors, after hours, so that they sort of try and get it both ways. How will that, there's lots of questions, undoubtedly, but I just feel that he's gone out there, the leader of the Labour Party has gone out there in Prime Minister's questions, he's gone out there on the television with it now. I think it will be very difficult for them to row back from, and therefore it needs to be high on schools' risk register, and schools have a big decision to make, which is whether they trim back on their capital plans for the new cricket pavilion or the new science lab or what have you, and whether they look at their class sizes and look at their offer and make a decision between doing what they were going to do anyway and hoping that parents will just dig ever deeper and keep up with it, or trying to trim off some of the impact by concentrating on the school's ethos rather than being absolutely up to the minute in terms of expenditure plans. So some difficult decisions for schools, but it certainly needs to be on the risk register and needs to be being actively discussed at governing body meetings and senior leadership team meetings.
Yeah, absolutely. What 3 things would you like to achieve in your role as chair of the APPG?
Well, I think one is to use the APPG as a vehicle for putting the case for the independent sector and its partnership work with the state sector forward, and keeping it at the forefront, promoting the work that the sector does, but making sure that work gets through to parliamentary colleagues as much as possible. The other is that I want to continue to draw on some of these international examples. independent schools are 70% of the sector. In Holland, for instance, they've been doing this since 1917 on essentially a sort of voucher system, but also in New Zealand, for instance, I've got a very good friend who's the head of Wanganui Collegiate School in New Zealand, which is a really lovely school, very reminiscent of my old school in many ways. And there, the state still pays the teachers' salaries, whichever sector they're in. In Australia, you get very high percentages of buy-in. So even though we've got this immediate threat, we can still learn from international examples, both in Europe and further afield in the sort of so-called Anglosphere, etc. And therefore, the third thing is to continue to provide a platform for school leaders, people involved in marketing, people involved in curriculum design, to have a platform to spread that sort of best practice and interesting thinking out to other people. You know, it's a great sector. It's made me feel very welcome. I always, you know, when I've got something with independent education in the diary for that particular day, as you can imagine, I have a lot of things in my diary. It really, you know, makes a lot of what I do seem very worthwhile. I mean, just in the last few weeks, I've been to Rugby, to Stowe, to Ampleforth, to Marist,
and I saw you at Scarborough College.
And to Scarborough College, where I was very privileged to be asked to be the speaker and the giver of prizes at Prize Day, which I really enjoyed. And Scarborough College is a really good example of a community-based independent school, really rooted in its local area, still quite accessible for parents on good but not, you know, international private jet type incomes, and yet has that interesting international boarding element as well. So really good example of a school that does all the things that make working in the sector so interesting.
Yeah, fantastic. And yeah, as you say, and we feel exactly the same. It's a real privilege to work with these schools. And, you know, they're doing amazing things for kids. They're very special, magical places. And, you know, our big belief, isn't it, stems from this is why I set up Stickman, is, you know, these places are changing lives and shaping futures. They certainly did mine. And so it's deep rooted in us, in me, and it sounds like it is in you too. So yeah, I love hearing that, and love that you're getting to visit all those gorgeous schools as well.
Yeah, and you know, more locally, I mean, for instance, I do a sixth form debating competition, and we had the local independent school in with 3 of my state schools in Northampton, and people got on really well, started talking, started comparing notes and working together. And that's a very rewarding element of all of this as well. It's that constituency angle to it, that local work that is such a key part of MP's work, as well as that wider policy picture as well.
Yes, brilliant. Yeah, my daughter's school, actually, they've been running the Saturday morning education courses for local primary schools. I think they've been doing it for the last 13 years in sort of computing or design technology, creative writing. And, you know, it's just great to see them working together in that way. And
there is, and it's very much a two-way street, Emily, as you say. So, you know, there are some really innovative and forward-looking state schools that actually have some super teachers, some innovative work that they do with sort of outdoors education, some of the courses that they offer and so on. That means that some of these partnerships are the best ones, are the absolutely two-way street partnerships that go on.
Yeah, 100%. Oh, I love that. And can I just ask you a slightly more frivolous question at the end here? So what did you want to be when you grew up?
Well, that's a good question, because I never actually had a plan. And when I'm speaking to people at schools, and sixth formers in particular, I always say I'm slightly suspicious of people who've decided by the time they're 15 or 21 that they want to be an MP, and that's what they want to do. So everything I've done for its own sake at the time. So when I was working in publishing, it wasn't, I'll put up with working in publishing for a few years until I can get into politics. It was about working in publishing, history publishing, which I loved. You know, I did history A-level university at Newcastle and Cambridge, and then on to the history publishing business. And then when I was in local government, I was in local government. You know, I was leader of Derbyshire County Council, achieving some things that you know, people underestimate what you can get done in a local authority. You can actually point to things and say, I've done that, in a way that in parliamentary politics you can't so much. And then again, when I became an MEP, that wasn't, oh, I'll put up with being in Europe as a step ladder to Westminster. So they've all happened in and of their own right. But I have to say, you ask a good question, because I will set against that the fact that when I made my first visit to Parliament, I had a very good friend in the sixth form, and it was a sixth form A-level visit to Parliament, and her daughter and my son go to the same primary school, so we're still friends all these many, many years later. And she reminded me that when we went to Parliament, when we were sixth formers, she said to me then, you'll end up here, Andrew. You're always going to be
Oh, are you
you'll
sick?
end up as an MP. And I said, no, that won't happen. But sometimes people have a better idea of where you're heading than you have yourself, and that was certainly the case there.
Oh my goodness, she predicted it. It's amazing. Oh, well, fantastic. Well, and isn't it funny how those experiences, like you visiting during sixth form, you know, has now just maybe just sparked something at the time, even though you maybe not have known it, and then you publishing and then onto politics. So
yes, yeah, and you know, it was a great visit. I still remember it very well. The strange thing was that the MP for Derbyshire Dales at the time, Patrick McLaughlin, had only just been elected when I made that sixth form visit, and yet when I was elected in 2017, moved from Brussels to Westminster, he was still there. So as a sixth former, I met him, and then I ended up sitting next to him on the green benches as members of Parliament together as well. So no, it was full circle. Wow. And I just remember again with this sort of traditional aspect that we were there as sixth formers. You know, it was a very traditional school, and you could see that people were like, well, who are they? You know, that's an interesting looking school. Who are they? And it just sort of planted a little seed that I didn't regard as a planted seed at the time, but obviously it did end up that way.
Yes, incredible. Wow, how inspiring. Absolutely loved hearing all about that. And I just want to say thank you, actually, because you're doing such brilliant work in a local context, in a national context, and, you know, further afield. It's just brilliant. And thank you for involving Stickman in that as well. We feel very privileged to do so. So thank you. And thank you for joining us on this interview. And we look forward to getting this out there so that lots of people can have a listen and benefit from the work you're doing.
Well, great. I've really enjoyed it, Emily, and thank you for everything you do at Stickman. You're really good at putting out positive stories about schools that do things in a really interesting way. And yet, as you say, you always, as an organisation, seem to understand the sort of continuity in history that appeals to people as well. So it's a lovely combination, and it's great to have taken part in this with you. Thanks again.
Oh, thank you very much, Andrew. Thank you.